Alright guys, welcome back to 635 Ministries. My name is Drew Ayers, and today I'm going to be starting a new series called The Case for Christianity, and we're going to be discussing the cosmological argument for the existence of God today. So before I jump right into that, I want to give a little bit of a background to this series that we're going to be starting on the YouTube channel. It's called The Case for Christianity, and its purpose is threefold. One, it is to substantiate sound doctrine and practice through apologetics and proper exegesis of Scripture. Two, it is to equip and inspire Christians to confidently contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, as talked about in Jude verse 3. And three, it is to remove hurdles for non-Christians. I put that hurdles in quote because I quote the great Norman Geisler, the great Christian apologist, in which he said, quote, "Apologetics is opening the door, clearing the rubble, and getting rid of the hurdles so that people can come to Christ." And what he meant by that is that I'm sure that you all have encountered somebody, or maybe you yourself are somebody, who has trouble believing in the things that the Bible teaches, such as the Trinity. A lot of people object to the Trinity because it simply doesn't make sense to them, right? And so apologetics, by engaging in fields like philosophy, might help us to understand the Trinity better and be more able to reasonably defend it. Another instance in which apologetics might be useful in removing intellectual hurdles is in understanding, say, miracles, right? Can miracles actually occur? Can we actually believe that the miracles in the New Testament actually happened, right? Because obviously miracles don't just, like a virgin birth, doesn't happen every day. And so that's what this series is really designed for. And as a result, we will come to understand core Christian doctrines and being able to reason through them from Scripture and from a variety of fields like philosophy, science, etc. So this format that we're going to be doing this is each presentation will present an argument that contends for Christianity while teaching apologetic tactics along the way. Because one of the things about apologetics is there are kind of two sides to it. One is the study aspect of it, and the other one is actually going and sharing the results of that study with somebody else. Some presentations may overlap or be revisited. As we'll see, there's going to be, as I present argument number 1, argument number 2, argument number 3, you're going to find that a lot of these tend to overlap in the concepts that we discuss to really point back toward, well, God and the Bible. These won't be every week, but they will all be under the same YouTube playlist, which you can find on our YouTube channel. There's going to be two types, I guess, of presentations. One is called offensive apologetics, in which I will advance a point, in which I will say, well, talking about the Trinity, I will maybe discuss how the Bible points toward the Trinity, and I'll make a case for that. Other times there will be more defensive apologetics, in which I make an entire presentation more so defending against an objection, such as, if God is so good and all-powerful, why does he allow evil to happen? And so that is defensive apologetics, in which I will sort of defend against an objection to Christianity. So with that, let's go ahead and just get on to the main presentation. So I guess the overarching theme behind these next 3 arguments that I'm going to be making for the case of Christianity, they all kind of make it reasonable to believe that God exists. And there's 3 main arguments that show this. I'm not talking about necessarily that the Bible is true or that the Christian God exists. I'm just, with these 3 arguments I'm about to present, it simply shows that it is reasonable to believe that God exists. The first one is called the Cosmological Argument. The second one is called the teleological argument, or sometimes better known as the argument from design, or the theory of intelligent design. And the third one is the moral argument. And so today I'm just going to be focused on the cosmological argument, and so the argument number 1 I'm going to posit today and put forth is that the cosmological argument makes it reasonable to believe that God exists. So what is the cosmological argument? And basically I put it in the form of a syllogism that is a logical statement. The first two are called premises, and the third one is called a conclusion. It's a series of logical statements that lead to conclusion by which we reason something out. So I say that premise one is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, I contend that the universe began to exist at some point in time. And my conclusion is three, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about what it takes for an argument to be true, and I also want to talk about what it means for an argument to be strong. Now, for an argument to be true, there are 2 points, 2 subpoints here. One is that it must be logically valid. This could either be strictly logical or, quote, loosely logically valid. Point number 2 is that its premises must be true. Now, for an argument to be strong, there are 2 subpoints here. One is that it should have good informal assumptions, such as it shouldn't have circular reasoning, nor something called abductive reasoning. Now, these things, if there is an argument that is, say, circular, it is circular reasoning, that doesn't necessarily mean it is not true. It just means it's a weak argument. And 4 is that it should be better than other explanations. This probably comes more into play whenever you're trying to discover the cause behind something or using like the historical scientific method. But whenever you make an argument, just broadly speaking, it should be better than other arguments or explanations of a known fact. Now let's apply all these 4 points to the cosmological argument. So if we look back at the cosmological argument here, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Now, if whatever begins to exist has a cause, then that means that the universe has a cause. That's pretty straightforward. So what this shows is that it is logically valid to make this statement. Now, the second point is that its premises must be true. And so if we look at the first one here that says whatever begins to exist has a cause, from basically all of our reasoning and all our daily experiences, it seems like this statement is true. Some will dispute this, such as like with an A theory versus B theory of time, or an appeal to quantum mechanics by saying that sometimes people appeal to quantum mechanics to say that something comes from nothing, which I'm going to talk about toward the end of this presentation. But for now, I think that it's just everybody's going to reasonably assume that whatever begins to exist has a cause. What I really want to focus on is the second premise, is that the universe began to exist. Because naturally, if I can show that the universe began to exist, then that must mean it had a cause. And then the question becomes, well, what is this cause? So I like to think of the argument that I'm going to show is sort of like the roof, and it has these pillars that hold it up. And so what I contend is that the universe began to exist, and it is from 7 lines of evidence, and they're all interrelated. The first one is cause and effect. Second one is relativity. The third one is entropy. Fourth is apple. Fifth is time. The sixth one is observations that we see, scientific observations. And the 7 is revelation. So an easy way to remember this is through the acronym CREATOR, C-R-E-A-T-O-R. And you can pause the video and write this down if you want on a piece of paper for future reference. So the first one I'm going to posit is that the cosmological argument is supported by the concept of cause and effect. The main principle behind this is that a cause must be greater than its effect in order to produce that effect. So a simple illustration from physics, right? If there is 100 pounds, saying, lying on the floor, in order for that to move, there must be somebody or something that exerts a force greater than 100 pounds on it in order for it to actually move. Or similarly, if someone throws a punch at, say, trying to break, like in karate class, like you're trying to break a board, say, that punch must have greater force than the resisting force of the board in order to break it. And so logically, a cause must be greater than its effect in order to produce that effect. This makes sense from just everyday life. And so what this means, and this doesn't necessarily show premise 2 to be true, this will actually come into play more later toward the end of the presentation after we get through the other 6 letters. But the point I want to make up front is that the idea that something came from nothing is meaningless. And so if the universe did begin to exist at some point in time, what this means is if you ask, well, what came before that or what caused it? And if somebody ever says, well, nothing existed before it, nothing caused it. Well, nothing can be equivalent to 0. And something can be equivalent to something that is greater than 0. And naturally, 0 is always going to be less than that number. So nothing is always going to be less than something, and it doesn't make sense that nothing could cause something. And that's the point I want to make here. Okay? So this is more, if I can show that the universe did begin to exist, if premise 2 does actually come to be true, then this actually may give us a clue as to what that cause actually may be. The R in the acronym CREATOR stands for relativity. Now ultimately, this stems around Einstein's theory of general relativity, published first in 1915. His theory of special relativity was published in 1905, but he built upon that work in 1915 through his general theory of relativity. Essentially what this posits is that instead of thinking of space and time as 2 separate entities, in reality it turns out that in our universe, space and time are one interwoven reality that we call space-time. And that matter exists in this sort of fabric called space-time, and as John Wheeler once said, matter that exists in that space-time continuum tells space-time how to curve, and curved space-time tells matter how to move. And so what this essentially posits and shows, and what Einstein showed, is that space, time, and matter are all co-relative. They all exist in one point in time at the same time, right? They all coexist. And so ultimately, instead of space and time existing apart from one another, they're interwoven in an indivisible unit called space-time. Now, think of it, all right? So if that means, so take matter, for example. So some people say that matter existed from all of eternity, right? Well, that must mean that matter occupies space. So that would mean that whenever there is matter, there must be space. But if space and time are an indivisible unit, that also must mean that time exists. Okay? Now hold that thought, because later we're going to talk about how the concept of infinite time is actually philosophically impossible. And so therefore, if time did have a beginning, then that must mean that space and matter also had a beginning. Okay? So hold that thought until T in creator. So the E in creator stands for entropy. Now, entropy is a component of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that if the physical process is irreversible, the entropy of the system and the environment must increase. The final entropy must be greater than the initial entropy. Now you might be like, well, that doesn't make any sense because I don't know what entropy is. I give a definition here from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. It says that entropy is, quote, a measure of the unavailable energy in a closed thermodynamic system that is also usually considered to be a measure of the system's disorder. Some people describe it as the degree of disorder or uncertainty in a system. Okay? Now, in other words, the universe is dying. Okay? So the second law of thermodynamics basically says that entropy is constantly increasing, which ultimately means the universe is going into a constant state of disorder. It's always moving toward more disorder, more decay. And what scientists say is that, hypothetically, this is going to cause something called thermodynamic equilibrium, or the heat death of the universe, when basically all the energy that is available for work, meaning all the energy that is available from motion, is going to basically all be converted to heat, in which nothing is able to move because there's no temperature differences between anything. There's no energy differences between anything. All the universe is at a constant energy. So let me give an example. A dying star. So in a star, what you have is chemical reactions that put out heat. All right? But whenever you have a star that explodes or dies, it emits a lot of heat, and that energy is no longer available for useful work. Right? That is maybe emitting heat to produce some sort of effect. A horseshoe, or metal in general, just rusting. It goes toward a lower state of chemical energy and chemical reactions. Or a car engine. A car engine is a great example. Whenever you burn gas, no engine is going to be 100% efficient. There's always going to be some loss of heat. And so the potential energy that is present in, say, gas and fossil fuels, whenever that is burned in a car engine, some of it is produced into energy that moves your car forward. Other energy is lost to heat that is no longer available for useful work. And so what you see is just a degrading, a disorder. It's constantly moving toward, well, whenever no energy is available to be used. Let me give an analogy. Imagine that this box, this white box I hear, is the entire known universe. And in it you have these cold objects represented by ice cubes, and then you also have hot objects represented by the flames. Now let's say that I take this box, and I have this box, and I put something cold in it, and I put something hot in it, and then I shut the lid and I walk away. Now when I come back, the hot things are going to emit all their heat and going to be cooled, so to speak, by the cooler things, and the cooler things are going to get hotter until it reaches a constant temperature within that box. This is going to be a puddle of water. Now the question is, what can reverse it back to ice cubes and fire? Can it be? And the answer is no, because I'm not able to open the box, because this white box here is the entire known universe. And so therefore no outside influence, at least according to mainstream science, no outside influence is possible to restore that back to its former state of lower entropy or higher order. Because a puddle of water, unless it's acted upon, is going to, well, stay a puddle of water. Let me give another analogy. A wind-up clock. So a wind-up clock works by, these are sort of old-fashioned things. I don't know if they exist anymore with digital clocks and things like that. But a wind-up clock works in that someone has to go and actually wind things up, and then the clock will tick. Well, eventually that clock is going to run out of energy due to frictional forces inside the clock, the tension of the spring running down, and eventually that clock's going to stop before someone winds it up again. And so if the clock is left alone, it will eventually stop ticking. This represents increasing entropy. You can think of it that way. And so the question is that we're ultimately going to answer, maybe not right now, is can I reason that the universe must have been, say, wound up? And I think I can. Because if the universe's entropy is currently increasing, that is, say, increasing disorder, right, and increasing decay, then according to the second law of thermodynamics, we are moving toward heat death at some finite point in the future. Right? It's a long time away, but that's what we're ultimately moving toward. And it's going to occur at some point, at some time in the future. Say, let's just say 5 trillion years away, but that's still a finite point in time. So think of it: if the universe is eternal and the total amount of energy is constant and finite, so the first law of thermodynamics, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, which implies that there's a finite amount of matter and energy, then the question is, why are we not already in heat death? And think of it this way, and we're going to cover this actually in the T of time a little bit more in depth, but if there is like an infinite regress of time back into history, then, and there are 5 trillion years by which the current state that we're in, we will run into the situation of heat death. Well, if the universe is infinitely old, then that should have already occurred. Think of it like a tank. Think of it like a car with a full tank of gas. It can only go so far, and it's never going to cover an infinite amount of road because it's going to run out of gas. And so a better explanation is that the universe must have had a beginning, because the opposite of something being eternal is something that had a beginning. And so with there, I'm actually going to stop this video, take a break, pause, and then I'm going to have a second part to this video where I continue the cosmological argument.